Welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm your host, Dave Reed. At Mondoweiss, we cover the movements, activists, and policymakers who affect the struggle for freedom in Palestine. Stefan Christoff is an organizer with Musicians For Palestine. Hundreds of musicians from around the world signed on to their first statement of support for Palestinian freedom in 2021. Today, the group is announcing 700 new signers and releasing a second statement. It reads, in part, quote, "As musicians, we can contribute to breaking the wall of silence and protest these great injustices taking place against the Palestinian people. We believe that now, more than ever, is the time to respect the Palestinian peaceful picket line by declining invitations to events that are subsidized or sponsored by the Israeli state, its lobby groups, or complicit cultural institutions." I spoke to Stefan about the work to organize musicians, and we heard from a few of the artists that have signed the statements, including Brian Eno. Check out the show notes for links to the Musicians for Palestine website and their podcast. Stefan, thanks for joining us today.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
This is an exciting organizing effort that's really taken off over the past year. Tell us about how the Musicians for Palestine project was launched and the response you've had so far.
It's clear that there's a shift within the world of cultural workers, filmmakers, visual artists, designers, and of course, musicians. A lot of people want to find a way to express their support for Palestinian human rights. And Musicians for Palestine was organized to try to respond to that interest. I think it's quite clear it existed. A lot of artists were sharing their thoughts, their responses to the violence on the part of the Israeli state in the attack on Gaza in May 2021. And in speaking with other musicians, I thought it was important that we could find a way to say something together. It was really in recognizing that there is a shift. And I think, to be honest with you, a lot of it comes out of the intersections of struggles for justice that were highlighted by Black Lives Matter in the United States, particularly where the intersectionality of struggle, looking at systems of colonial violence, how that translates on an individual daily level, as we see in terms of policing, structural violence, systemic racism, but how that plays out on a systemic level globally. And I think one very clear example of structural state-instituted colonial violence today is in Palestine, where we see this confluence of structures of violence on the ground expressed through the Israeli military occupation. And we see, of course, a lot of sharing between U.S. police forces and the Israeli military. That's very open. It's very public. And given this connection that was drawn by a lot of activists, I think also more broadly in the cultural sphere, people could understand that the reality in Palestine wasn't sort of this mysterious conflict with, two parties in this non-ending war that didn't have any context, which is often how it was presented in mainstream discourse for many years, but actually was part of a global system of colonial violence. And this is a very contemporary articulation of that. So in that context, when a lot of musicians were sharing their solidarity and their support for Palestine during the bombardment of Gaza in 2021, we thought it was important to create a platform where people could say that together and that there would be a strength in numbers, essentially, to refuse silence. So that's why we organized the appeal, and that's some of the context.
And today you're announcing a new statement, and 700 new musicians have signed on to it. What's in this new statement, and why are you launching it right now?
Well, basically, what we're trying to say is that, unfortunately, that's a very light way of describing it, but the reality is that Musicians for Palestine needs to exist now more than ever. We see not just the articulation of violence against the Palestinian people in Gaza, we see gradual and also very quick ethnic cleansing within the West Bank of Palestine, in the Negev, in Sheikh Jarrah, in Silwan. Many communities are experiencing colonial encroachment. We see the attack on key Palestinian civil society organizations. I'm sure that some people who are listening to this podcast will be aware of that, but Stand with the Six, very important human rights groups within Palestine have been criminalized, and international human rights groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have drawn attention to this. We saw the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, Palestinian journalist who was murdered by a shot fired by the Israeli military. It's clear now. Mm-hmm. All this context that has been reported, I think we wanted to acknowledge that, we released this first list of supporters in May 2021, and it's now September 2022. And although I think popular understanding about the structural violence in Palestine, especially within Gen Z millennial culture, has shifted, which is great, policy hasn't changed, right? But I think that art and culture is going to play a really key role in pushing forward the urgency of the situation and eventually, hopefully, equaling policy change. Because it's not just a dry discussion of policy, it's human lives, right? This is a situation of extreme violence in Palestine, and it needs to be addressed. So we're doing this today because we felt, first of all, we wanted to honor the fact that like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, like more, probably thousands of people sent us a message through musiciansforpalestine.com wanting to join this statement. And it wasn't an open statement because we are trying to actually be in touch personally with every musician who adds their name so that we can have like a global network where we can share updates, where we can actually create links between these artists. And so we wanted to make sure to share the fact that like so many people got in touch and reached out and wanted to be part of this. So that's why we're releasing this new list of supporters.
Have you found that there's an understanding among musicians already about the need to boycott Israel over the occupation and the apartheid regime, or are you doing education and outreach to musicians on the situation?
Well, I found that, there's a lot of conversation, Dave. And one thing that is really, I think I should be transparent about this is there's quite a few musicians that we've contacted who didn't agree to sign. And our approach wasn't to say, well, how dare you not sign this letter? Was to say, well, why? What do you think? Like, where are you coming from? Right? Sometimes there's no content there, but sometimes there are legitimate, thoughts, reflections. Sometimes people also just aren't informed. And the answer will be, well, like, sure, can we talk about this? Can you share more information? And sometimes that results in people wanting to support. And sometimes it results in people taking time to reflect, which is also fine. Like, I think that's fine. Like, this is an intervention. This is a political intervention, a social intervention in the artistic world and in the music world particularly.
This many years after the BDS movement started, what is your sense of how well it's penetrated? I mean, you're working with musicians, but in the musician community, how much do people even know about it?
I think people are aware that there's a deep critique of Israeli state policy. I think that what is always interesting in terms of a context where state policy is criticized, or even on a municipal level, like policing policy is criticized, or, in the Canadian context where I live in the colonial state of Canada, where Canada's policy towards Indigenous people is criticized. And with social media, we see a lot of people participating in this critique, in these hashtag moments where systemic issues are coming to the front. But how do we address these things together is really, a question that I don't think has one answer. But one thing we were trying to do in this context was to say, well, let's try to say something together. So I think people are aware of what's happening in Palestine, but a lot of musicians I've talked to don't know what to do, right? And not that saying the statement, saying we are musicians for Palestine, basically it's a response to the appeal by Palestinians, which you mentioned, Dave, for people to not participate in cultural events or concerts or festivals that have a link to Israeli state funding. And of course it's modeled after the boycott of the apartheid government in South Africa. So it's one way to take action. At least it's a way that people can respond to the appeal of Palestinian groups on the ground who are asking people to take action in this way. It's rare, actually, when you have a very extreme manifestation of violence on the part of a state, that the people on the ground experiencing that violence are articulating a clear appeal to say, this is how we want people to respond internationally. And in the case of Palestine, there is a response globally because Palestinians have said, we are asking for you to respond in this specific way, which is to not, participate in festivals linked to the Israeli state funding, etc. So it's a process. I don't think it's, it's something that we'll be visiting for our lifetimes, right? But at least this is a way to engage with an important part of society, which is music.
In last year, in 2021, your group launched a podcast where you interview some of the musicians that are taking a stand for Palestinian freedom. And you've got some clips for us to share with our audience today. Who's this first musician that we're going to hear?
Yeah, so Damon Davis is from St. Louis, and he is very involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. He was on the ground in Ferguson when Michael Brown was killed, and this is in 2015, and there was mass protests around the United States, but really centered in Ferguson, which is just outside of St. Louis. It's his hometown. So we wanted to feature Damon's work because he's so deeply involved in the artistic aspects of Black Lives Matter as a moment, but also as a movement in the organizational level. He did a beautiful project called All Hands on Deck, where he photographed the hands of organizers on the ground in St. Louis and Ferguson, and he blew up like in huge photocopies of the pictures of all these hands, and it was the hands of the community organizers who were organizing on the ground in Ferguson to protest the killing of Michael Brown. And when the city had boarded up all the shops, he went and did wheat pasting of all these hands all across Ferguson. It's called All Hands on Deck. It got a huge amount of attention, and rightfully so. But I think it really speaks to his practice, which is ongoing. He also makes music, excellent music, and he's part of a music collective in St. Louis. So yeah, I wanted to feature him because he actually helped us mobilizing some artists for Musicians for Palestine, and was part of the organizing within Black Lives Matter that expressed support for Palestine. And he talks about in this interview his education on the situation in Palestine happening in relation to people he met on the ground at Black Lives Matter protests who were Palestinian in the United States.
That's great. Well, let's take a listen.
First time I hear about the type of weaponry that was being used on us, being used on people in other places, Palestinians were sending information to help us against tear gas, how to build masks, how to get it out of your eyes. These are Palestinian people tweeting back and forth with Ferguson protesters, and there was a solidarity there that was just, I couldn't ignore it, and it was, and so I started to learn more, and I have friends now to this day that were just educating me from a human level, but people like, I grew up here and this is what I had to go through, and they looking you in your eyes and they telling you what they done seen, and they telling you the direct similarities to the way that I grew up, and the things that happened to me and my community that the government did. So it starts to broaden the conversation about what oppression is and who getting oppressed, and meeting people in real life that have been through stuff that is comparable to what we saw in Ferguson and what I personally went through, and good genuine people that cared about me and I cared about them, and just just trading stories is where this is my inception into understanding more about what Palestinian people are continually being or what they're continually up against. You know what I'm saying? That's where I learned about it, and that's where my journey started to, and that's where I started to meet people and befriend people and build relationships with Palestinian people on the streets.
It's so powerful to hear that connection between the Palestinians and the people in Ferguson who were standing up for their rights.
Yeah, and I think also just it's often not recognize the learning that happens within social movements, and I think that there's a very, very important amount of education and sharing and knowledge building that happens within the context of protest movements. And I think this is still like a sort of a perception that is not commonly held, not just within mainstream discourse, but I think often even activists maybe don't give the value needed to this idea of social movement spaces as being places of knowledge and learning. Mm-hmm. And I think we hear that expressed in what Damon's talking about in the context of the ideas that were shared on the ground during the Black Lives Matter protests in Ferguson.
This next clip, who are we going to hear?
Asher Gamedze is a drummer, a percussionist, a writer, academic based in Cape Town, South Africa. He actually helped us in some of the structuring of language for the first statement of Musicians for Palestine. And it was really interesting to engage with him on the text because he really pushed us to make sure that the text, and I agreed with him, but when you're working on something, often, people will bring in ideas that will just add to the process, right? And I found his ideas really, really helpful and important in terms of broadening the statement. He really wanted us to include language that expressed how what we were saying about Palestine was connected to other struggles for liberation, for freedom around the world. And I think those terms can often be used sort of in a light way, but when we're talking about struggles for freedom, right, we're talking tangibly about how these systems of violence affect people's lives, right? And in the South African context, that's obviously a system change that Asher and his whole family experienced, in terms of the end of apartheid, right? Yeah. And the freedom movement there tangibly reoriented, in a lot of ways, the entire nation state of South Africa. Now, that doesn't mean the struggle there is over. There's a lot of inequality, a lot of structural injustice that remains, but it was an important change, right? And so I think hearing from him in the context of Musicians for Palestine was important, both because it shows that there's not a clear ending point in any of these struggles, which I think often is another sort of perceptive thing that we need to sort of rethink, right? That these things take place across generations, but also just because he was involved in actually writing the letter. And he's also an awesome musician. His album, Dialectic Soul, is just beautiful.
It's amazing. Let's hear a little bit from him.
I think there's some kind of similarity or resonance between the South African anti-apartheid struggle and the Palestinian struggle. Both of these regimes in their particular areas and in their historical moments, the apartheid regime in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even now, but in that time of the big anti-apartheid movement, the South African regime played such a fundamental role as an ally of Western imperialism in Southern Africa and in the continent more broadly. So that relates to the way the Cold War was playing out and how a whole range of proxy wars were being fought in Southern Africa. It also, relates to very real kind of capital interests from European and American capital in South Africa, which is exploiting the rest of the region. And then, of course, in the contemporary moment, and, not just the contemporary moment, but historically, occupied Palestine, Israel plays such an important role in the area that people refer to as the Middle East, as an imperialist ally in that space, and for a whole range of reasons, right? There's other kind of historical reasons as to why, for Western Europe, Israel is an important political symbol and material reality. And in terms of, so I think there's that resonance between South Africa and Palestine in the way they relate to kind of imperialism broadly, and in their importance as almost junior partners of imperialism within the regions that they are.
I love how he makes that that political link between what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, to the reasons the U.S. is involved, and the larger capitalist structures in play, which is what you were talking about before we played the clip.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think what is important, in terms of a project like Musicians for Palestine, is I hope that it's a way of opening a bunch of little windows, right? So people can sort of look up the work of all the different musicians, look up what they're saying. And why we wanted to do the podcast was to illustrate how people are supporting Musicians for Palestine, not simply to say we stand with Palestine, but they're coming to that from a context, right? And their local context and local situation, and their creative practice as musicians is informed by that, right? So he's talking about his reality in South Africa and how there are connections. There's huge differences, but there are parallels that are important to consider. And I always think it's really also cool to hear musicians who do instrumental music talking about how social and economic and political realities inform their practice. And in the case of jazz, there's a long history of that. And hearing that from the South African context is cool.
So we heard Damon talk about a very direct experiential connection he had to the situation in Palestine. And Asher talked about the political connection. This last clip is from Brian Eno, a legendary musician and producer. And he talks about a spiritual connection. Tell us about how you connected with Brian and his involvement with this movement and with the Musicians for Palestine effort.
Yeah, well, I'd really encourage people to listen to the conversation with Brian Eno, but also the other musicians, because I think they're super interesting. I mean, to hear what the musicians are saying, absolutely. and to just sort of hear their perceptions and perspectives. And part of the conversation with Eno, which is not in the clip I sent you, is he talks about how he's actually born on May 15th, 1948. So he talks about his sort of journey with Palestine and with the Israeli state project as happening in the same time frame of his life. And as a progressive,
for listeners in context, I mean, he links his birth on that date to the Nakba in 1948 when Palestinians were driven out of their homes.
Yeah, and also is very transparent to say that he was a supporter of the Israeli state project for a long time. Yeah. I don't mean like a financial supporter in any big way, but it was something he hadn't really thought through. And in the 1980s, that started changing, I think, mostly in result of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. But yeah, so I think it's just also interesting to think, when we're in this age of social media where we expect everybody to know and to be able to respond to understanding all these systems of structural violence and these inequities in the moment, that sometimes people aren't aware or haven't thought through things, right? And that's not a great thing, but these processes take time, right? And I like what Eno's talking about of how he learned about Palestine over time. And I think that's really helpful in this moment to think about also, because he's become today a very important supporter of Palestinian human rights. As in the music world. And he talks about why. And he also talks about sort of not being, I don't know how to describe it, but in the clip that you mentioned, Dave, I think what he's also pointing to is this idea that within any historical moment, there's not one dominant force that is, sort of calling the shots, as it were, on a spiritual level, on a cultural level, on a political level, that there's a dynamic, right? And there's a continuum, and that exists in relation to our concepts of history, but it also relates to what we do or don't do, right? And it just underlines why trying to say something with all its imperfections is important, because you're raising your voice. Now, is that the answer? No, but it's one tiny drop within a process of social change.
Yeah. Well, let's listen.
There's never one spirit of the times. There's always lots of them. And they're always sort of fighting with each other and supporting each other. There's lots of spirits in any time. So I don't know what the German would be for that sort of multi-zeitgeist idea. But I think when we listen to music, when you listen to a piece of music, you don't only hear that piece of music. You hear that piece of music in relation to your whole history of listening to music. So what you notice is a difference. You think, ooh, that's so jagged, it's so exciting, that jaggedness. So jagged, or let's say rough or fierce, is a quality that you respond to. And you respond to it not in absolute terms, but by how much it's different from what you've heard before. And then another quality might be very smooth. Another quality might be really fast. Another quality might be super funky. Another quality might be really gentle. You know, these are all things, but they're all in relation to other things you've heard.
Stefan, you've been involved in the solidarity movement with Palestine for a long time and have put a huge amount of work into this project, bringing musicians into the movement in a really substantial way. Thinking about what Brian Eno was just talking about, what do you think the spirits of our time are pointing toward when it comes to the Palestinian struggle for freedom?
There's a huge opening. I think people are more understanding of the situation of Palestine as a manifestation of colonial injustice. And I think it's the link that's important here, right?
Yeah.
Like in Canada, for example, what I've seen in the last 15, 20 years is more and more people aware of the fact that Canada's a state founded on the genocide of Indigenous people. More and more people are willing to talk about that. I mean, when I was a teenager, I remember going to demonstrations. There'd be 10 of us, to support, an Indigenous land-based struggle, literally.
Yeah.
In the western parts of Canada. I remember this as a teenager. And there's been a huge shift. But I think what's happening is people are seeing more and more the connections between things, right? Like, and understanding the colonial structures. It's not a continuum. It's not always going to be all forward or all back. I think it's confusing. It's complex. I'm really disappointed of the way that, here in Canada, CBC has just been broadcasting consistently coverage of Queen Elizabeth's death, and
yeah.
It's just so irrelevant, A, but B, it's also relevant, which is the problem, and the fact that these are unresolved issues, right? Like, why is this British person having dominion over Canada? It makes no sense, but it's also reality, right? Like, why does this U.S.-backed Israeli state military apparatus have, basically carte blanche over colonizing more and more territory in Palestine? It's not just, it's not cool. It's not acceptable. It violates all sorts of international law. So we need to figure out how to say something. The moment is here in terms of more people being open to these ideas, but how do we actually translate that openness to change of system? Now, I don't have any clue as to the big answer to that question, but there's lots of small answers. And I think artists being part of that process is important, and saying that we can intervene and say things together at key moments is important, but it's a tiny part. And I think there's not one answer. There's a bunch of millions of small answers, and that's when things start to move.
I think you sell your effort a bit short. I think that the role of artists in upholding boycotts and supporting liberation struggles is critically important. And it's so good to see this project take off and get the kind of attention and engagement that it's gotten. Where can people find you and the project online to learn more about it?
Well, musiciansforpalestine.com. The hashtag is Musicians for Palestine. You can just find everything there.
Are musicians still able to sign on to the statements?
There's a contact form on our website. You can add your name. We tried to be in touch with everybody, and it's not, which makes things slow, but the idea is really that we actually have a connection with the people who are reaching out to us. It's not a form. It's not like you just enter
It's
your
not
name.
a petition. It's not a petition. It's an organizing effort.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because we actually want to have the conversations with people, right? And I'm also just have accepted the fact that means it takes time, and it's okay. But so I mean, we released a statement in May 2021, and we're releasing one in September 2022. But and as we articulated, it's because Palestine still needs support. Palestinians are calling for support, and so we're trying to respond to that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We will link to all of this in the show notes. Stefan, thank you so much for joining us today on the Mondoweiss podcast and sharing these powerful voices with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure, Dave. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for listening to our show. Visit our site to sign up for free daily and weekly newsletters on Palestine, Israel, and related U.S. politics. If you're enjoying our podcast, please consider becoming a donor by visiting mondoweiss.net/donate. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication, and every donation of any amount helps sustain our work. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find our show.